Chapter 4, Unit 4, Financial Sector. Part 4.1, Financial Assets. What is a financial asset? Anyway, let's start with a question that sounds almost too simple. What do you actually own when you own a financial asset? Unlike a car or a sandwich, you can't touch it. A financial asset is essentially a claim, a legal promise that someone owes you something. Think of it like an IOU written on fancy paper. When you buy a bond, a stock, or put money in a savings account, you're trading your money today for a promise of future value. That's the core idea, and everything else in this section builds on it. The AP exam loves to test whether you understand the relationship between financial assets and the real economy. Here's the key bridge. Financial assets channel money from savers, people who have more than they spend, to borrowers, people who want to spend more than they currently have. Banks, bond markets, and stock markets are all just different plumbing systems doing that same job. The big three: money, bonds, and stocks. Let's walk through the three financial assets the College Board cares most about. Money is the simplest. It's the most liquid asset, meaning you can use it right now without converting it into anything else. The trade-off? It pays essentially no return. Holding cash under your mattress earns you zero interest. This is the fundamental tension with any financial asset: liquidity versus return. The more liquid something is, the lower its typical return. Bonds are where things get interesting and where most students lose points on the AP exam. A bond is a loan you make to a government or corporation. They promise to pay you back the face value, also called par value, at maturity, plus regular coupon payments, interest, along the way. Think of it like this. You lend your friend $1,000, and they pay you $50 a year for 10 years, then hand you back your $1,000. That annual $50 is the coupon, and $1,000 is the face value. Here's the relationship that trips up nearly every student, so tattoo this on your brain. Bond prices and interest rates move in opposite directions. When interest rates rise, existing bond prices fall, and vice versa. Why? Imagine you hold a bond paying 3% interest. Now the market rate jumps to 6%. Nobody wants your boring 3% bond unless you discount the price, so its market value drops. This inverse relationship is one of the most tested concepts in all of Unit 4. The yield of a bond is effectively its actual return based on the current market price, not the face value. When bond prices fall, yields rise. When prices rise, yields fall. Same inverse relationship, just from a different angle. Stocks represent ownership, a share of equity in a company. Unlike bonds, stocks don't come with a guaranteed return. You're betting the company grows and either pays dividends, profit distributions, or sees its share price increase. Stocks are generally riskier than bonds, which is why they tend to offer higher average returns over time. Higher risk, higher potential reward, that's a principle you'll see echoed throughout macroeconomics. Loanable funds and the role of financial markets. Here's where your AP exam connects 4.1 to the bigger picture. Financial markets facilitate the loanable funds market, the market where savers supply funds and borrowers demand them. The price in this market is the real interest rate. When the real interest rate rises, saving becomes more attractive, more reward for waiting, so the quantity of loanable funds supplied increases. When it falls, borrowing becomes cheaper, so demand increases. This is why the Federal Reserve cares so deeply about interest rates. By influencing rates, it can encourage or discourage borrowing and spending across the entire economy, a concept you'll explore deeply in Unit 5. Common AP pitfalls. One classic mistake: confusing nominal interest rates with real interest rates. The real interest rate adjusts for inflation. Real rate equals nominal rate, inflation rate. This is called the Fisher equation, and the AP exam will absolutely ask you to apply it. If a bank offers you 5% interest but inflation is 3%, your real purchasing power only grew by 2%. You earned less than you think. Another pitfall is assuming bonds are always safe. They're safer than stocks in many cases, but they carry interest rate risk. The risk that rising rates will erode the market value of your bond before maturity. A helpful mnemonic for the bond-price relationship: rates rise, bonds cry. When interest rates rise, bond prices fall. Say it out loud a few times. You'll thank yourself during the exam. Putting it together. Financial assets are the connective tissue of a modern economy. They allow savings to flow toward productive investment. They reflect risk and return trade-offs, and they respond dynamically to interest rate changes. Whether it's a bond issued by the U.S. Treasury or a share of stock in your favorite company, every financial asset is ultimately a mechanism for moving money through time. With this foundation locked in, we're perfectly set up to explore how banks create money and how the banking system multiplies those deposits into something far larger than you'd expect. Part 4.2, Nominal v. Real Interest Rates. What's the difference, and why does it matter? Let me paint you a picture. Imagine your grandma tucks a $100 bill under her mattress in 1990 and tells you to come back for it in 30 years. You finally pull it out in 2020 and great news, it's still $100. But here's a quiet tragedy. That $100 can now only buy what maybe $60 or $70 could back in 1990. The money didn't shrink in your hands, but its purchasing power did. That gap between what a number says and what it actually buys is exactly the tension we're navigating today when we talk about nominal versus real interest rates. Defining the terms. The nominal interest rate is the rate you see advertised, the number printed on your bank statement, your car loan, your mortgage paperwork. It's the sticker price of borrowing money. If your savings account says it pays 5% interest, that's nominal. It sounds great until you remember that inflation is out there quietly eating away at every dollar you earn. The real interest rate, on the other hand, adjusts for inflation. It tells you what you actually gain in purchasing power after inflation has taken its bite. This is the number that economists and policymakers genuinely care about because it reflects the true cost of borrowing and the true reward for saving. The Fisher equation, your best friend on the exam. Here's the formula you absolutely need to know cold. Real interest rate, nominal interest rate, minus inflation rate, that's it. Economists call this the Fisher equation, named after Irving Fisher, who figured out in the early 1900s that lenders and borrowers should always be thinking in real terms. Think of it like your paycheck. If your boss gives you a 3% raise, but inflation is running at 4%, you didn't actually get a raise, you got a pay cut in disguise. Same logic applies to interest rates. So if a bank offers you a nominal interest rate of 6% and inflation is 2%, your real interest rate is 4%. You're genuinely 4% better off in terms of what you can purchase. But flip it around. If nominal rates are 3% and inflation is 5%, your real interest rate is negative 2%. You're actually losing purchasing power even while earning interest. This happens more than people realize, and it's a critical concept for the AP exam. Why this matters for borrowers and lenders. Here's where it gets beautifully intuitive. Borrowers love unexpectedly high inflation. Why? Because they borrowed dollars that were worth more and they get to pay back dollars that are worth less. It's like borrowing a full pizza and returning a slightly smaller one, and your lender has to accept it. Lenders, of course, hate this. They want to be compensated for expected inflation, which is exactly why nominal rates tend to rise when inflation expectations rise. The market is essentially the lender saying, I see what you're doing with that pizza. This relationship is built into the Fisher equation in its more complete form. Nominal rate equals real rate plus expected inflation. Lenders set nominal rates by starting with the real return they want and then adding a cushion for inflation. This is why when the Fed signals that inflation is rising, you often see mortgage rates and loan rates climb even before actual inflation fully arrives. A common AP pitfall: don't mix up higher with better. One of the most reliable traps on the AP exam is assuming that a higher nominal interest rate is always better for savers or worse for borrowers. Remember, what matters is the real rate. A nominal rate of 10% during a period of 9% inflation gives you a real rate of just 1%. Meanwhile, a nominal rate of 4% during 1% inflation gives you a real rate of 3%, which is actually the better deal for savers. Always, always subtract inflation before you draw a conclusion. The memory hook. Here's a mnemonic that students love. Nominal is naive, real is revealing. The nominal rate is what it looks like on the surface. Naive, face value, unadjusted. The real rate reveals the truth once you peel back the inflation layer. Whenever you see an interest rate question on the exam, ask yourself, has inflation been accounted for yet? If not, you're still in nominal territory. Connecting to the bigger picture. The real interest rate doesn't just affect individual savers and borrowers, it drives investment decisions across the entire economy. When real interest rates are low, borrowing is cheap in real terms, so businesses are more willing to take out loans and invest in new equipment, factories, and hiring. When real rates are high, those same investments start looking less attractive. This is why the Federal Reserve watches inflation so carefully. By controlling nominal rates through monetary policy, they're indirectly steering the real interest rate and through that, influencing every major investment and spending decision in the economy. With that foundation firmly in place, let's move forward and explore how the financial sector channels all these decisions through the market for loanable funds. Part 4.3 Definition, Measurement, and Functions of Money. What is money really? Let's start with a question that sounds almost too simple. What is money? You've been using it your whole life, but if someone asked you to define it, you might stumble a bit. Here's the thing. Money isn't just coins and paper bills. Money is anything that a society broadly accepts as a medium of exchange. That's the key phrase. Your professor's signature on a napkin isn't money. A bar of gold sitting in a vault could be money, if everyone agrees it is. Money is fundamentally a social agreement, and that's what makes it so fascinating. Economists identify three core functions of money, and you absolutely need to know all three for the AP exam. Think of the acronym MSD, money serves as a den. Well, let me give you something better. Think of Uncle Sam, money, is a store of value, medium of exchange, the A stands for accepted, and a unit of account, a M measure of value. The three functions of money. As a medium of exchange, money solves what economists call the double coincidence of wants problem. Imagine you're a farmer with extra wheat and you want shoes. In a barter system, you'd have to find a cobbler who also happens to want wheat right now in the exact quantity you have. What a nightmare. Money steps in as the universal middleman. You sell wheat for dollars, then use those dollars to buy shoes. Simple, efficient, elegant. As a unit of account, money gives us a common language for value. Instead of saying that car is worth 500 goats, we say it's worth $25,000. It creates a consistent measuring stick so we can compare the prices of wildly different things. A haircut, a hospital visit, a hot dog, all on the same scale. As a yin store of value, money lets you save purchasing power over time. You do work today, get paid, and that money holds its value so you can spend it next week, next year, or next decade. Now, money isn't a perfect store of value. Inflation slowly erodes it, but it's far better than, say, storing your wealth in fresh strawberries. Measuring the money supply, M1 and M2. Here's where students often trip up on the AP exam, so pay close attention. Economists measure the money supply in different ways, primarily using M1 and M1, N1 and M2. M1 is the most liquid, most narrowly defined measure of money. It includes physical currency in circulation, bills and coins, demand deposits, your checking account, and other liquid deposits. Think of M1 as the money you can spend right now immediately without any waiting or conversion. If it can go straight from your hand or your account to the cash register, it's M1. M2 is broader. It includes everything in M1, plus savings deposits, money market accounts, and small denomination time deposits like CDs, certificates of deposit. These assets aren't quite as immediately spendable, but they're still relatively liquid. You could convert them to cash fairly quickly. Think of M2 as M1 plus almost money. M2 is always larger than M1 because it contains M1 within it. A great way to visualize this: imagine a set of Russian nesting dolls. M1 is the inner doll, the core. M2 is the bigger doll surrounding it, containing everything M1 has plus a little more. On the AP exam, if you're asked which measure is larger, M2 wins every time. The characteristics of good money. The AP exam also loves asking about the characteristics that make something a good form of money. Money works well when it is durable, it doesn't fall apart. Portable, easy to carry. Divisible, can be broken into smaller units. Uniform, each unit is identical, acceptable, widely recognized and trusted, and limited in supply, scarce enough to hold value. This is why we don't use sand as money. It fails on limited in supply and uniform. Gold historically worked well on most of these dimensions, which is why it served as money for centuries. Commodity versus fiat money. One last distinction worth locking in. Commodity money has intrinsic value. It's worth something even if it stops being used as money. Gold coins, silver, cigarettes in a prison economy. These are commodity money. Fiat money, on the other hand, has value purely by government decree and social trust. The US dollar is fiat money. That green bill in your wallet is essentially a very well-trusted IOU from the federal government. It has no intrinsic value. You can't eat it, build with it, or fuel a car with it. But because everyone agrees it's valuable, it is valuable. The common AP pitfall here is confusing the two. Remember, fiat money derives its value from trust in law, not from the material itself. Connecting forward, with a firm understanding of what money is, what it does, and how we measure it, you're perfectly set up to explore how banks actually create money through lending, which is exactly where we're headed next. Part 4.4 Banking and the Expansion of the Money Supply. The bank isn't just holding your money. Here's something that might surprise you. When you deposit $1,000 into your checking account, the bank doesn't just tuck it into a drawer with your name on it. It lends most of it out. And that simple fact is the engine behind one of the most powerful and frequently tested concepts in AP macroeconomics, the money multiplier. Let's build this from the ground up. Required reserves and the reserve ratio. Banks are required by the Federal Reserve to hold a fraction of every deposit on hand. This is called the required reserve ratio, RRR, sometimes just called the reserve requirement. If the RRR is 10%, that means for every $100 deposited, the bank must keep $10 in reserve and can lend out the remaining $90. Those held funds are called required reserves, and anything the bank chooses to hold beyond that minimum are excess reserves, essentially money sitting on the sideline. Think of it like a restaurant that's required by the health department to keep a certain number of staff on duty at all times. That's the minimum. The restaurant could keep more staff, but that comes at a cost. Banks behave the same way. Excess reserves are safe, but they don't earn interest on loans they never make. How money gets multiplied. Here's where it gets fascinating. That $90 the bank lends out, it doesn't disappear. The person who borrows it spends it, and whoever receives that payment deposits it into their bank. Now that bank has $90 in new deposits, holds 10% $9, and lends out $81. That $81 gets deposited somewhere else, and the cycle continues. Each round, the amount gets smaller, but it keeps going. This process is called money creation through the banking system, and the formula that captures it is elegantly simple. Money multiplier equals 1 divided by reserve ratio. So with a 10% reserve requirement, the multiplier is 10.10 equals 10. That means an initial deposit of $1,000 can ultimately create up to $10,000 in the money supply. Not by magic, but through this chain of lending and redepositing, repeated over and over. The formula for the maximum change in the money supply is delta money supply equals initial deposit times my multi, or equivalently, a delta money supply equals new reserves divides reserve ratio, a helpful mnemonic, 1 over RRR rules the money multiplier. Say it a few times. It sticks. The real world complicates things, but don't panic. The AP exam knows you're smart. So here's where students often slip up. The money multiplier gives you the maximum possible expansion. In reality, the actual increase is usually smaller. Why? Because people don't always redeposit every dollar. Some cash gets stuffed in a mattress or kept in wallets, and banks often choose to hold excess reserves rather than lending everything out, especially during economic uncertainty. The 2008 financial crisis is a perfect real-world example of this. Banks were sitting on enormous excess reserves rather than lending, which is part of why monetary policy had muted effects. So when the AP asks you for the maximum increase in the money supply, use the multiplier formula. When it asks what actually happens, acknowledge that leakages reduce the real-world impact. Open market operations and the starting point. You might be wondering, where do those initial deposits even come from? A big answer is the Fed. When the Federal Reserve conducts an open market purchase, buying government bonds from banks, it injects new reserves directly into the banking system. Those fresh reserves become the starting point for the multiplier process. Conversely, when the Fed sells bonds, it pulls reserves out, contracting the money supply. This is why open market operations are the Fed's most powerful day-to-day tool. A $100 million bond purchase doesn't just add $100 million to the economy. It potentially multiplies through the system many times over. Common AP pitfalls to avoid. One of the most common mistakes on the exam is confusing what the bank can lend versus what the entire system creates. If someone deposits $1,000 and the RRR is 20%, the first bank can lend out $800, not $5,000. The full $5,000 expansion is what the whole banking system achieves over many rounds. Keep that distinction sharp. Another pitfall. Make sure you're applying the multiplier to excess reserves, new money entering the system, not total deposits that already existed. If the Fed buys $50 million in bonds, that $50 million in new reserves is what gets multiplied, not some pre-existing figure. Finally, remember that a higher reserve requirement means a smaller multiplier and less money creation. Lower reserve requirement, bigger multiplier, more expansion. This inverse relationship is a favorite of AP exam writers. Bringing it together, the banking system at its core is a beautifully interconnected machine. One deposit ripples outward, each bank passing along a slightly smaller wave of lending until the effect dissipates. The reserve ratio is the dial that controls the speed and scale of that ripple. Understanding how the Fed adjusts that dial and how banks respond is fundamental to everything coming next. Speaking of what's coming next, now that you understand how money gets created, we're ready to explore how the Federal Reserve actively manages that process through its monetary policy tools. Part 4.5, the money market. What is the money market really? Okay, picture this. You're at a farmer's market, but instead of tomatoes and honey, everyone is buying and selling money itself. That's essentially what the money market is, a conceptual market where the price of holding money is determined by supply and demand. And here's the twist that trips up almost every student the first time. The price of money isn't dollars and cents. It's the nominal interest rate. When interest rates are high, holding cash is expensive because you're giving up a lot of return. When rates are low, holding cash is cheap. Keep that idea close. It's the engine of everything in this section. The demand for money. So why do people demand money in the first place? Economists identify two main motivations. The first is the transactions demand. You need money to buy things, groceries, rent, a coffee. The second is the asset demand. People hold money as a store of value rather than putting it into bonds or other investments. Here's the key insight. The asset demand for money is inversely related to the nominal interest rate. When interest rates are high, you'd rather park your wealth in a bond that's paying you 8% than let it sit in your wallet earning nothing. When rates are low, that trade-off becomes less painful, so people are more comfortable holding cash. Put those two together and you get the money demand curve, MD, which slopes downward, just like a regular demand curve, with the nominal interest rate on the vertical axis and the quantity of money on the horizontal axis. This is one of those AP graphs you absolutely must be able to draw from memory. What shifts the money demand curve? Think about anything that changes how much money people want to hold at any given interest rate. A growing economy means more transactions, so MD shifts right. Higher price levels mean you need more dollars to buy the same stuff. MD shifts right. A recession, MD shifts left. An easy mnemonic here is PIT, price level, income real GDP, and transactions volume are your demand shifters. The supply of money. Now for the supply side. And this is where the money market gets beautifully weird. The money supply, MS, is controlled by the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, and it doesn't respond to interest rates. The Fed decides how much money is in the economy through tools like open market operations, the reserve requirement, and the discount rate, though the AP exam loves open market operations most. Because the money supply is set independently of the interest rate, the MS curve is drawn as a vertical line. It doesn't slope, it just stands straight up like a wall. That vertical shape is your signal that the quantity of money supplied is fixed by policy, not by market forces. Equilibrium and the interest rate. Where MD and MS intersect, you find the equilibrium nominal interest rate. This is the price that balances how much money people want to hold with how much exists in the economy. If you can visualize two curves, one downward sloping, one perfectly vertical, meeting at a single point, you've got the money market graph down. Now here's where the AP exam loves to test you. What happens when the Fed wants to lower interest rates? It buys bonds on the open market, pumping money into the economy. The vertical MS line shifts, right? With more money available, the equilibrium interest rate falls. Conversely, if the Fed sells bonds, money gets pulled out of the economy, MS shifts left, and interest rates rise. This is expansionary monetary policy versus contractionary monetary policy, and knowing which direction each shifts MS and what happens to interest rates as a result is absolutely essential for the AP exam. The big pitfall, nominal versus real interest rates. Here's the trap that snags students every single year. The money market determines the nominal interest rate, not the real interest rate. The real interest rate, which matters for investment decisions in the loanable funds market, is adjusted for inflation. Don't mix these up on free response questions. The money market equals nominal rates. Loanable funds market equals real rates. Tattoo that distinction somewhere useful. Another classic mistake is confusing a movement along the money demand curve with a shift of the curve. A change in the interest rate moves you along MD. A change in income, price levels, or transaction needs shifts MD. Same logic as any other supply and demand graph, the AP exam tests this distinction constantly. Connecting it all. The money market doesn't exist in a vacuum. Changes here ripple through the entire economy. When the Fed lowers the nominal interest rate through expansionary policy, businesses find borrowing cheaper, investment spending rises, and aggregate demand shifts right. That connection from the money market to investment to aggregate demand is the bridge you'll need in later questions. With the money market firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to see how all of this connects to the broader macroeconomic picture, especially when we explore monetary policy in action and its effects on output and the price level. Part 4.6 Monetary Policy. What is monetary policy and who's in charge? All right, let's talk about one of the most powerful tools in the economic toolbox, monetary policy. Think of the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, as the economy's thermostat. When the economy gets too cold, unemployment rising, growth slowing, the Fed turns up the heat. When things get too hot, inflation spiraling out of control, they cool it down. Monetary policy is simply the Fed's control over the money supply and interest rates to pursue its dual mandate, stable prices and maximum employment. Keep that thermostat image in mind because everything we discussed today connects back to it. The Fed's toolkit, how they actually do it. The Fed has three classic tools, but one dominates the AP exam conversation. The first is open market operations, the buying and selling of government bonds. This is the big one. When the Fed buys bonds from banks, it injects money into the banking system, expanding the money supply. When it sells bonds, it pulls money out, contracting the supply. Easy way to remember it. Buying bonds equals more money, selling bonds equals less money. The second tool is the reserve requirement, the percentage of deposits banks must hold and cannot lend out. Lowering this frees up more money for loans. Raising it does the opposite. The third tool is the discount rate, which is the interest rate the Fed charges commercial banks for short-term loans. Lower it, and banks borrow more and lend more freely. Raise it, and borrowing gets expensive across the board. Expansionary versus contractionary, the big distinction. Here's where the AP exam really wants to see you think clearly. There are two directions monetary policy can go, and you need to know both. Cold expansionary monetary policy, sometimes called easy money, is what the Fed does during a recession. They buy bonds, lower the reserve requirement, or lower the discount rate. The goal is to increase the money supply, which pushes interest rates down. Lower interest rates mean cheaper loans for businesses and consumers. More investment, more spending, more output, the economy warms back up. On the money market graph, the money supply curve shifts right, driving the nominal interest rate down. Contractionary monetary policy, tight money, is the recession's opposite. The Fed sells bonds, raises the reserve requirement, or raises the discount rate to shrink the money supply and push interest rates up. Higher rates cool down borrowing and spending, which reins in inflation. On the graph, the money supply curve shifts left, and the interest rate rises. The transmission mechanism, following the domino chain. One thing AP students often struggle with is tracing the full chain of cause and effect. Let's walk through it together for expansionary policy. Domino by domino, the Fed buys bonds, money supply increases, interest rates fall, investment increases, aggregate demand increases, real GDP rises, and unemployment falls. That sequence is gold. If the exam asks you to trace the effects of an expansionary monetary policy, that chain is your answer. A critical concept nestled in here is the investment-demand relationship. Interest rates and investment move in opposite directions. Lower rates make borrowing cheaper, so businesses invest more. That investment is a component of aggregate demand, which is why the AD curve shifts right when the money supply expands. Graphs to master. You'll need two graphs on your mental chessboard. First, the money market graph. Money supply, a vertical line, since the Fed controls it directly, and money demand on axes of quantity of money versus nominal interest rate. When the Fed expands the money supply, that vertical line shifts right, and the equilibrium interest rate falls. Second, after identifying that rate change, you connect it to the ADA's model, where increased investment shifts the AD curve rightward, raising the price level and real output. Common AP pitfalls. Here's a mistake I see constantly: confusing the federal funds rate with the discount rate. The federal funds rate is the rate banks charge each other for overnight loans. The Fed influences this rate through open market operations, but doesn't set it directly. The discount rate is what the Fed charges banks directly. Know the difference. Another pitfall is assuming monetary policy is instant. In reality, there are significant time lags. It takes months for policy changes to ripple through the economy. The AP exam may ask about this limitation, so don't ignore it. Finally, watch your directions on the money market graph. The money supply is vertical because the Fed, not market forces, determines it. If you draw it as a downward sloping curve, you'll lose points. Keep it vertical and shift it left or right based on the policy direction. A quick mnemonic. To lock in the sequence, try this: braid, bonds bought, rate falls, and investment increases, demand rises. It's a little quirky, but quirky sticks. Now that you've got monetary policy under your belt, the Fed's tools, the two policy directions, and the all-important transmission mechanism, let's zoom out and see how monetary policy interacts with fiscal policy and the broader economy in a way that will make both topics click even more deeply. Part 4.7. The Loanable Funds Market. What is the loanable funds market anyway? All right, picture this. You've got some money sitting in your savings account, and across town, someone else wants to borrow money to open a bakery. How do those two people find each other? That's exactly what the loanable funds market does. It's the market where savers and borrowers meet, and the price they agree on is the real interest rate. Think of it less like a physical place and more like a giant matchmaking service for money. The supply of loanable funds comes from savers, households, businesses, and even foreign investors who are parking their money somewhere. The demand for loanable funds comes from borrowers, businesses wanting to invest, governments running deficits, and individuals financing big purchases. The real interest rate, the price of borrowing. Here's something the AP exam loves to test. So engrave this in your brain. The loanable funds market uses the real interest rate, not the nominal one. The real interest rate adjusts for inflation, so it reflects the true cost of borrowing. The relationship between them is the Fisher equation. Real interest rate equals nominal interest rate minus inflation rate. Lenders care about the real rate because it tells them how much purchasing power they're actually earning. If your bank pays you 5% nominal interest, but inflation is 4%, you're really only gaining 1% in purchasing power. The real interest rate is what makes savers and borrowers tick in this market. Supply and demand and the curves that go with them. Now let's build the graph, because you absolutely will need to draw this on the AP exam. The real interest rate goes on the vertical axis, and the quantity of loanable funds goes on the horizontal axis. The supply curve slopes upward. As real interest rates rise, saving becomes more attractive, so the quantity of funds supplied increases. Makes sense, right? If your savings account suddenly offered 10% real interest, you'd probably cut back on lattes and sock more away. The demand curve slopes downward. As real interest rates rise, borrowing becomes more expensive, so businesses and households demand fewer loans. They're less likely to take out that business loan if the cost of repaying it is sky high. Where those two curves cross is your equilibrium, the market clearing real interest rate, and the quantity of funds borrowed and lent. Shifting the curves. This is where the magic happens. Shifts are the heart of this topic, and the AP exam is obsessed with them. Let's start with the supply of loanable funds. Anything that increases savings shifts the supply curve to the right, lowering the equilibrium real interest rate. A classic example: the government reduces taxes on savings, or households suddenly feel more cautious about the future. Hello, economic uncertainty, and start saving more. Foreign capital flowing in also shifts supply, right? This is crucial for understanding how open economies work. On the flip side, if the government runs a budget deficit, it's actually borrowing from the loanable funds market itself, which decreases the supply of funds available to private borrowers and shifts supply left. This is the famous crowding out effect. Government borrowing crowds out private investment by pushing real interest rates up. Now for demand. Businesses demand loanable funds primarily to invest, buy new equipment, build factories, expand operations. If businesses become more optimistic about future profits, investment demand rises and the demand curve shifts right, raising real interest rates. A technological boom works the same way. Conversely, a pessimistic business outlook or a recession can shift demand left, reducing real interest rates. Crowding out, an AP fan favorite. Let's linger on crowding out for a second because it's one of the most tested concepts in this entire unit. When the government increases spending and finances it by borrowing, it enters the loanable funds market as a big, powerful borrower. This increases demand for loanable funds, shifting the demand curve, right, and driving up the real interest rate. Higher real interest rates make private investment more expensive, so businesses pull back. Government spending crowds out private investment, like a big kid cutting in the lunch line and leaving less food for everyone else. A helpful mnemonic, GRIP: government borrowing raises interest rates, reducing private investment. Common AP pitfalls to avoid. A few traps students fall into every single year. First, don't confuse nominal and real interest rates. This market runs on real. Second, remember that government budget deficits affect the demand for loanable funds. Government is borrowing, but if taxes on savings change, that affects supply. Third, when drawing the graph, label everything clearly: axes, curve labels, equilibrium point, and the direction of any shifts. AP graders reward precision. Finally, don't forget that in an open economy, foreign investment in domestic financial markets is a source of loanable fund supply. It's a right shift in supply, lowering real interest rates, tying it all together. The loanable funds market is really a story about how saving becomes investment, the engine of long-run economic growth. Every time you trace a shift in this market, you're watching how policy decisions, consumer behavior, or business confidence ripple through the entire financial system and ultimately determine how much a nation invests in its own future. With a solid grip on loanable funds, you're perfectly set up for our next topic, the money market, where we zoom in on how central banks influence the supply of money and short-term interest rates directly.